Emma Richardson had kept her secret for 6 years, through dating Derek, through their wedding, through the announcement of her pregnancy, that she was the estranged daughter of Richard Richardson, the trillionaire whose technology empire had revolutionized global communications. But as she lay in her hospital bed, hemorrhaging at 7 months pregnant, watching her husband refuse to pay her medical bills, while his mistress Veronica laughed triumphantly, Emma realized her silence had cost her everything. Derek had always seen Emma as his inferior, a simple woman from nowhere who should be grateful he'd married her, despite her apparent poverty, who should accept his criticism about her inability to contribute financially to their marriage. But he'd never questioned why Emma seemed so educated, so cultured, so composed despite her modest lifestyle. The divorce papers Derek threw onto Emma's hospital bed were supposed to be his liberation, his escape from a wife he'd convinced himself was dragging him down, but they were actually his death sentence, financially, socially, and emotionally. Veronica's manicured hand rested possessively on Derek's shoulder as they turned to leave Emma alone with her medical crisis, her laughter cutting through Emma's pain like shattered glass. But neither Derek nor his mistress saw Emma reach for the phone that would change everything. The call Emma made wasn't to beg or plead, but it activated a network of power so vast that within hours Derek's modest accounting firm would receive calls from clients suddenly canceling contracts. His mother, Catherine, would open her door to find lawyers bearing revelations that would literally make her collapse. But most devastating of all, Derek would finally see his pregnant wife's face on the news identified as the missing heiress, whose family had been searching for her for over a decade. Derek had thrown away the woman who'd loved him enough to abandon billions, who'd chosen him over unimaginable wealth, who'd worked minimum wage jobs rather than reveal her identity. But would this truth emerge in time to save Emma and their baby from the medical emergency Derek had refused to address? And when Derek's world came crashing down around him, when he finally understood that his pregnant wife's poverty had been a choice, while Veronica's interest in him had been purely strategic, would his remorse mean anything? Or would Emma's next move prove that some betrayals can never be forgiven? This gripping narrative explores the true meaning of love versus materialism, revealing how one woman chose authenticity over wealth only to be betrayed by the man who should have valued her most. Educational value. Viewers will learn about the importance of appreciating people for who they are rather than what they have, understanding that love cannot be measured by bank accounts, and recognizing that character reveals itself most clearly during crisis moments. Viewer benefits. This story provides deep satisfaction through dramatic irony and justice, teaches valuable lessons about humility and gratitude, and reinforces that genuine relationships require seeing beyond surface appearances to recognize true worth. The antiseptic smell of St. Michael's Hospital mixed with the metallic scent of blood as Emma Richardson pressed her hand against her swollen belly, feeling her baby kick weakly against her palm, while the monitors beside her bed screamed warnings that her medical team had been ignoring for the past 40 minutes because her insurance authorization remained unsigned. She'd called Derek 3 hours ago, her voice breaking as she explained that her placenta was detaching, that their daughter was in distress, that she needed emergency surgery within the next 2 hours, or they might lose everything. But Derek's response had been silence followed by a cold promise that he was handling it. Emma had believed him then, still clinging to the illusion that 6 years of marriage meant something, still hoping that the man she'd abandoned her entire world for would choose her when it mattered most. But the hope died the moment Derek walked through her hospital room door with Veronica's hand clasped in his. Derek Mitchell looked nothing like the nervous accountant who'd proposed to Emma 7 years ago outside that small coffee shop in downtown Portland, back when his eyes had held wonder instead of contempt, back when he'd called her his miracle because she'd loved him without demanding the expensive lifestyle his previous girlfriends had required. Now his 6-foot frame filled the doorway with an arrogance that made Emma's chest tighten. His tailored suit, purchased with the bonus from his recent promotion, making a statement that he'd outgrown her, but it was the woman beside him who truly shattered what remained of Emma's fragile composure. Veronica Chase wore power like a second skin, her designer heels clicking against the hospital tile with the confidence of someone who'd never been denied anything, her perfectly manicured hand resting possessively on Derek's arm, while her lips curved into a smile that held no warmth, only victory. "You're not signing the authorization," Emma whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth as she watched Derek's face confirm what his silence had already told her. The monitor beside her bed began beeping faster, matching the acceleration of her pulse, but Derek didn't move toward her, didn't show any concern for the medical crisis unfolding before his eyes, and Emma felt something inside her chest crack. Not her heart, because that had broken weeks ago when she'd found Veronica's messages on Derek's phone, but something deeper, something that had kept her tethered to the hope that their marriage could survive his betrayal. "I've consulted with my lawyer," Derek said, his voice carrying the rehearsed quality of someone who'd practiced this speech, who'd prepared for Emma's tears and pleas, but who clearly hadn't prepared for the absolute stillness that overtook her features. "Veronica helped me understand that I've been manipulated, that you probably got pregnant deliberately to trap me financially, that I don't even know if this baby is actually mine." Each word landed like a physical blow, but it was Veronica's soft laugh, a sound like crystal shattering that finally broke through Emma's shock and replaced it with something colder, something that had been sleeping inside her for 6 long years. Derek reached into his briefcase with movements that seemed choreographed, pulling out a manila folder that Emma recognized immediately as divorce papers, documents that represented the end of everything she'd sacrificed, everything she'd believed about love transcending circumstances. He threw them onto her hospital bed with a casualness that suggested he was discarding trash rather than abandoning his wife and unborn child, the papers landing across her swollen belly like a death sentence. But what destroyed Emma completely was watching Veronica wrap both arms around Derek's waist from behind, her chin resting on his shoulder while her eyes met Emma's with undisguised triumph. "You'll be fine," Derek said, his tone suggesting he'd convinced himself this was kindness rather than cruelty, that leaving Emma alone in a medical emergency was somehow justified by whatever lies Veronica had whispered in his ear during their affair. "You always manage somehow, I'm sure. Your mysterious family will help you now that you actually need them." The sarcasm in his voice revealed how Derek had twisted Emma's carefully maintained boundaries into evidence of deception, how he'd transformed her privacy about her past into proof of manipulation, but he had no idea that his mockery was about to become prophecy. Emma's hand trembled as she reached for her phone on the bedside table, her vision blurring with tears that she refused to let fall, while Derek and Veronica could still see them, while they could still witness her devastation and mistake it for weakness. Derek turned toward the door, clearly believing the conversation was finished, believing he'd successfully extracted himself from an inconvenient marriage. But Emma's voice stopped him with 2 words that carried more weight than he could possibly comprehend. "You're right." Derek paused at the doorway, his shoulders tensing at Emma's unexpected response, but he didn't turn around because turning around would mean acknowledging the woman he was abandoning, the wife whose pain he'd already decided wasn't his responsibility anymore. Veronica's fingers tightened on his arm, urging him forward, away from the hospital room that smelled of blood and broken promises, but Emma's next words froze them both mid-step. "You're right that my family will help me now. You're right that I've been keeping secrets. But you're wrong about everything else, Derek, and that mistake is going to cost you more than you can possibly imagine." The certainty in Emma's voice carried none of the desperate pleading Derek had anticipated, none of the bargaining or begging that Veronica had assured him would come. And for the first time since entering the room, Derek felt a flutter of unease in his chest that he immediately suppressed because Emma was bluffing. She had to be bluffing because the alternative meant that the past 6 years had been built on lies he'd been too arrogant to notice. He glanced back over his shoulder, expecting to see Emma crying or reaching out to him, but instead she was sitting upright, despite the blood soaking through her hospital gown. Her phone pressed to her ear, her face transformed into something he'd never seen before, regal, commanding, utterly unlike the submissive wife who'd accepted his criticisms and his mother's condescension for years without complaint. "Father," Emma said into the phone, her voice steady despite the pain that must have been coursing through her body, despite the medical crisis that was literally threatening her life and their baby's survival. "It's Emma. Yes, it's really me. I need you now." The word father hit Derek like a physical blow, because Emma had always claimed she was estranged from her family, had always deflected his questions about her past, with vague references to complicated relationships and bridges she'd burned. But she'd never mentioned having a father who she could call during an emergency, who would apparently answer on the first ring after years of silence. Veronica's laugh cut through the tension, sharp and mocking, her confidence unshaken because she'd researched Emma thoroughly during her affair with Derek, had found no social media presence, no wealthy connections, no evidence of anything beyond the modest library assistant who wore thrift store clothes and drove a 15-year-old Honda. "Your father?" Veronica's voice dripped with theatrical sympathy that barely masked her contempt. "Emma, this is pathetic even for you. Derek's made his choice. Stop embarrassing yourself with fantasy rescue stories and sign the divorce papers like an adult." Her words should have stung, would have devastated the Emma who'd existed 2 hours ago, but the woman on the hospital bed simply looked through Veronica as if she were already irrelevant, already erased from a narrative that was about to shift completely. Emma's attention remained focused on her phone call, her free hand still pressed against her belly where their daughter continued her weakening kicks, where the medical emergency Derek had refused to address was counting down to catastrophe. "St. Michael's Hospital, room 407. I need the surgical team authorized immediately. Placental abruption at 30 weeks. And Father, I need you to send Thompson." Derek didn't know who Thompson was, couldn't understand why Emma's voice had dropped to something almost apologetic when she said that name, but he watched her close her eyes as if bracing for impact before continuing. "Yes, I know what that means. Yes, I'm sure. Derek threw divorce papers on my bed while I'm hemorrhaging because he won't pay my medical bills. His mistress is here laughing at me. Our daughter might not survive the next hour without intervention." Each sentence Emma spoke was calm, factual, empty of the emotion that Derek had expected, that he'd been counting on to make his departure feel justified rather than monstrous. The phone call lasted less than 2 minutes, but Derek felt time stretching unnaturally as he watched his wife, his soon-to-be ex-wife, transform into someone he didn't recognize, someone whose composure under crisis revealed training or background that shouldn't exist in a woman who'd worked minimum-wage jobs throughout their entire marriage. When Emma finally lowered the phone, her eyes met Derek's with an expression that made his blood run cold, not because it held anger or hurt, but because it held pity, as if she was looking at someone who'd just signed his own death warrant without realizing it. "Help is coming," Emma said quietly, her hand finally leaving her belly to grip the bed rail, as another contraction hit, as the monitors screamed louder warnings that the medical staff could no longer ignore. "For me and for our daughter, you should leave now, Derek. You should go home to your mother and enjoy the next few hours of your normal life. Because after Thompson arrives with my father's legal team, after the truth comes out about who I actually am, nothing will ever be normal for you again." The prophecy in her words should have sounded like desperation, like the last threats of a woman with no power. But something in Emma's absolute certainty made Derek's confidence waver for the first time since Veronica had convinced him that divorcing his pregnant wife was the smart financial move. Veronica pulled at Derek's arm more insistently now, clearly sensing the shift in atmosphere, clearly wanting to escape before Emma's breakdown became ugly. But Derek found himself rooted to the spot, staring at his wife's face and suddenly seeing 1,000 small details he'd dismissed over the years. The way Emma had navigated his mother's country club events with effortless grace despite claiming no social training. The way she'd corrected his pronunciation of French wines despite supposedly never traveling abroad. The way his CEO had looked at Emma during last year's company Christmas party with something that might have been recognition before Emma had quickly excused herself to the bathroom. "Who are you?" Derek heard himself ask, the question emerging before his pride could stop it, before Veronica could pull him away from the answer that was about to destroy everything he thought he knew. Emma's smile was sad and terrible as she watched the first crack appear in Derek's certainty, as she saw him finally question the narrative he'd built about their relationship. But her response was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Patricia Chen, the hospital's chief of surgery, whose expression was professionally neutral, but whose presence at this hour in this room suggested that Emma's phone call had already triggered consequences Derek couldn't yet comprehend. "Mrs. Richardson," Dr. Chen said, her use of Emma's maiden name hitting Derek like a second revelation because he'd never heard anyone call his wife that, had assumed Richardson was just a generic surname from a past Emma never discussed. "Your authorization has been approved. We're prepping the surgical suite now. Your father's medical team is being helicoptered in from Seattle. They'll arrive in 40 minutes, but we can't wait that long given your condition." The doctor's words were professional, clinical, but her eyes held a wariness as she glanced at Derek and Veronica that suggested she knew exactly what had transpired in this room, exactly what kind of man would abandon his wife during a medical crisis. Emma nodded, her composure finally cracking as relief flooded her features, as the immediate threat to her baby's life was temporarily suspended. But her eyes never left Derek's face as she delivered her final words before the medical team descended to rush her toward surgery. "Richardson Technologies, Derek. You might want to Google it while you're driving home. And when my father's people arrive at your mother's house in approximately 3 hours, when Thompson explains to Catherine exactly who she's been treating like hired help for the past 6 years, tell her I said I'm sorry. I'm sorry that her greed and yours are about to cost her everything she spent her life building." Derek's hands shook on the steering wheel as Veronica scrolled frantically through her phone beside him, her earlier confidence evaporating with each search result that loaded. Each impossible headline that confirmed their worst fears were actually catastrophic underestimations of the disaster unfolding around them. "Richardson Technologies," Veronica whispered, her voice hollow with dawning horror as she read aloud from Wikipedia. "Founded 1987 by Richard Richardson, current net worth estimated at $847 billion, primary holdings in telecommunications infrastructure, satellite networks, and artificial intelligence development. The company controls 63% of global data transmission hardware and employs over 400,000 people across 47 countries." Each fact landed like a hammer blow, but it was the next paragraph that made Derek swerve slightly into the next lane before correcting. "Richardson's only child, Emma Catherine Richardson, disappeared from public life in 2019 at age 23, following a dispute with her father about arranged marriage expectations. She was last seen leaving the family estate in Seattle and is believed to be living under an assumed identity somewhere in the United States." The profile picture accompanying the article showed a younger Emma, her hair styled differently, her clothes designer rather than thrift store, her smile polished for cameras, standing beside an older man whose steel-gray eyes held the same quiet intensity that Derek had seen in his wife's face back in that hospital room, the same unshakable certainty that came from wielding power most people couldn't even conceptualize. Derek pulled over to the side of the highway because his vision was blurring, because his brain couldn't process the mathematical impossibility of what he'd just done, the cosmic scale of his miscalculation in throwing divorce papers at a woman whose father's daily interest earnings exceeded Derek's entire lifetime earning potential. She worked at the library, Derek heard himself say stupidly, desperately, as if repeating the facts of Emma's modest lifestyle could somehow undo the revelation currently destroying his understanding of reality. She drove a Honda Civic with 200,000 miles on it. She bought groceries with coupons. She wore the same winter coat for 5 years. Each detail that had once confirmed Emma's poverty now revealed itself as evidence of a test Derek had catastrophically failed. A woman who'd stripped away every advantage to see if anyone would love her for herself, who'd chosen him over unimaginable wealth, who'd proven her devotion in the most absolute way possible, while Derek had repaid her sacrifice with contempt and abandonment. Veronica's face had gone pale as she continued scrolling, her perfectly applied makeup suddenly looking garish against her bloodless skin, her designer outfit now seeming cheap and desperate compared to the wealth Emma had abandoned to be with Derek. "There are articles about her disappearance," Veronica said, her voice climbing toward panic as the implications crystallized. Her family hired investigators. There's a standing reward of $50 million for information, leading to her safe return. Derek, your wife, your pregnant wife that you just divorced, is literally one of the most sought-after missing persons in the country, and you threw papers at her while she was hemorrhaging because I told you she was trying to trap you financially. The accusation in Veronica's final sentence revealed how quickly loyalty dissolved when consequences arrived, how the woman who'd laughed at Emma's suffering was already repositioning herself as Derek's victim rather than his co-conspirator. Derek's phone began ringing with a number he didn't recognize, but he ignored it because his mind was racing backward through 6 years of marriage, recontextualizing every moment through this new lens of understanding. Emma's refusal to discuss her family wasn't shame about poverty, but protection of a secret that could have ended their relationship's authenticity. Her contentment with modest living wasn't low standards, but deliberate choice. Her grace under his mother's condescension wasn't weakness, but strength beyond anything Derek had comprehended. Catherine Mitchell had treated Emma like a charity case for years, making snide comments about her clothes at family dinners, suggesting Derek could do better with someone more ambitious, criticizing Emma's failure to provide grandchildren quickly enough. But all along, Emma had been enduring abuse from people whose combined net worth couldn't buy a single floor of her childhood home. The phone rang again, then again, different numbers each time, but Derek couldn't move to answer because his paralysis had deepened into something approaching catatonic shock as the full weight of his actions crystallized. He'd refused to pay medical bills for a woman who could have bought the entire hospital with pocket change, had accused of gold-digging someone who'd abandoned billions to be with him, had chosen Veronica, whose interest in him had indeed been purely strategic, as Emma had known, over a wife whose love had been proven through the most extraordinary sacrifice imaginable. The divorce papers he'd thrown so casually onto Emma's hospital bed now represented not liberation but the single worst decision of Derek's life, a mistake so profound that no amount of remorse could ever balance the scales. "We need to go back," Derek finally managed, reaching for his keys with hands that wouldn't stop trembling, his voice cracking with desperation that came 6 hours too late. "We need to get to the hospital before her father arrives. I need to apologize. I need to explain that I didn't know, that if I'd known..." But even as Derek spoke, he recognized the pathetic futility of his words, because Emma's identity wasn't the point. Because his behavior toward a woman he'd believed poor revealed exactly who he was. Because the fact that he'd abandoned his pregnant wife during a medical crisis couldn't be undone by the revelation that she was rich. Veronica grabbed Derek's arm before he could start the car, her eyes wide with calculations that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with survival. "Derek, listen to me. Going back now makes it worse. You think her father's security team will let you anywhere near her after what you did? You think apologizing before you've consulted with lawyers is smart?" Her questions revealed how quickly affection transformed into self-preservation, how the woman who'd urged Derek to divorce Emma was now focused entirely on protecting herself from the consequences of that decision. But Derek barely heard her because his phone was ringing again, and this time he recognized the number, his mother's landline, the phone Catherine only used for emergencies because she considered cell phones beneath her dignity. "Mom?" Derek answered, his voice hollow with dread, because he knew, somehow he knew, that Emma's prophecy was already unfolding, that Thompson, whoever Thompson was, had already arrived at Catherine's house, with revelations that would shatter her world, the same way Derek's had been shattered 20 minutes ago. The sound that came through the phone wasn't his mother's voice, but something animalistic and broken, a wailing that raised every hair on Derek's neck, followed by his Aunt Gloria's panicked shouting in the background, "Call 911, Catherine's collapsed, she's not breathing right, oh God, I think she's having a heart attack." Derek's phone slipped from his nerveless fingers as the call continued, as he heard multiple voices overlapping in his childhood home, as the chaos playing out 50 miles away confirmed that Emma's warning had been prophecy rather than threat. His mother had opened her door to men in expensive suits, bearing information about the daughter-in-law Catherine had mocked and belittled for years, had learned that every condescending comment about Emma's second-hand dresses had been directed at a woman who'd chosen poverty over privilege, who'd endured abuse from people who should have been grateful for her presence in their lives, and the shock had literally made Catherine's body surrender to the weight of realization. Veronica was pulling at Derek's arm, trying to get him to drive toward his mother's house rather than back to the hospital, her priorities revealing themselves in her panic. But Derek sat frozen behind the wheel as the mathematical impossibility of redemption crystallized in his mind. There was no apology sufficient for what he'd done, no explanation that would transform abandonment into anything forgivable, no amount of remorse that could undo the moment he'd thrown divorce papers onto his pregnant wife's hospital bed while she fought for their daughter's life. Emma had loved him enough to abandon $847 billion, had worked minimum wage jobs to prove her devotion wasn't transactional, had chosen him over a world of privilege most people couldn't even imagine, and Derek had repaid that extraordinary love with the cruelest betrayal possible. The irony crushed Derek beneath its weight. He'd divorced Emma because Veronica had convinced him that keeping a poor wife would limit his ambitions, would prevent him from accessing the wealth and status he deserved. But Emma had been his access to wealth beyond his most grandiose fantasies, and he'd thrown it away because he'd been too shallow to see value that wasn't advertised, too arrogant to recognize that a woman's worth couldn't be measured by her wardrobe or her job title. His phone continued ringing with unknown numbers, undoubtedly Richardson Technologies' legal team beginning the process of dismantling Derek's life with the same casual efficiency he'd displayed when abandoning his wife. But Derek couldn't bring himself to answer because there were no words for what he'd done, no explanation that would make him anything other than the villain in a story that would define the rest of his existence. 3 weeks later, Derek sat in the lobby of Richardson Technologies' Seattle headquarters, a building whose glass and steel architecture reached 40 stories into the gray Pacific Northwest sky. surrounded by security personnel whose quiet vigilance made clear he was tolerated rather than welcomed in this space his wife had once called home. The surgery had saved Emma and their daughter, Lily Catherine Richardson, 7 pounds 3 ounces, born via emergency C-section, while Derek had been sitting paralyzed in his car. But Derek hadn't been allowed anywhere near the hospital room, hadn't been permitted to see his child except in photographs that Emma's lawyers had provided alongside custody documentation that made Derek's parental rights contingent on behavioral assessments and supervised visitation. The divorce papers Derek had thrown so casually onto Emma's hospital bed had been processed with remarkable speed, facilitated by lawyers whose hourly rates exceeded Derek's monthly salary. But Emma hadn't taken anything from him in the settlement because there was nothing he possessed that held any value to a woman who'd never needed his money, only his love. Catherine Mitchell had survived her cardiac episode, but the woman who'd emerged from the hospital was diminished in ways that transcended physical health, her former arrogance replaced by a haunted awareness that her cruelty toward Emma had cost her son everything that mattered. Derek's accounting firm had dissolved within a week of Emma's identity becoming public, his clients abandoning him not because of legal pressure. Richardson Technologies hadn't needed to threaten anyone, but because associating with the man who'd abandoned a pregnant trillionaire's daughter during a medical emergency had become toxic to their own reputations, their own social standing in a world where perception determined survival. Veronica had disappeared even faster, her phone number disconnected, her apartment vacated, her social media accounts deleted as she fled from the wreckage of her strategic miscalculation, leaving Derek alone with consequences that multiplied daily like compound interest on a debt he could never repay. The receptionist's voice pulled Derek from his spiral of regret. "Mr. Richardson will see you now." Derek stood on shaking legs, his ill-fitting suit, the expensive one he'd worn to abandon Emma, had been repossessed along with most of his other possessions, marking him as an outsider in this temple of wealth his wife had abandoned to be with him. The elevator ride to the 40th floor felt like ascending toward judgment, each floor a reminder of the vertical distance between Derek's former life and the world Emma had left behind. But when the doors opened, Derek found himself facing not the cold corporate executive he'd expected, but a man whose grief-lined face revealed that wealth couldn't protect anyone from the pain of seeing their child hurt. Richard Richardson stood beside floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Seattle, his silver hair and tailored suit projecting authority that needed no announcement. But his eyes held the same exhaustion Derek saw in his own mirror each morning, the look of someone who'd failed someone they loved, though their failures existed in vastly different categories of magnitude. "She agreed to see you," Richard said without preamble, his voice carrying the weight of a father who'd spent 6 years searching for his daughter, who'd finally found her only to discover she'd been suffering abuse from people who should have cherished her. "Not because she forgives you. Emma's very clear that forgiveness isn't something you've earned or deserve, but because Lily deserves to know her father if you can prove you're capable of being one." The conditionality of Richard's statement stripped away any fantasy Derek had nursed about reconciliation, about apologizing his way back into Emma's life, about somehow undoing the devastation he'd caused through sufficient remorse. Derek nodded mutely, following Richard through corridors lined with photographs documenting Richardson Technologies' evolution, past conference rooms where decisions affecting millions of lives were made daily, toward a private wing that Richard explained housed family apartments for when work demanded overnight stays. Each step felt like walking toward execution, but Derek had demanded this meeting, had begged Emma's lawyers for the chance to apologize directly, to see his daughter, to somehow begin the impossible process of atonement. Emma sat in a sunlit room decorated with understated elegance, her daughter sleeping in a bassinet beside her chair, her body still recovering from the traumatic delivery Derek's refusal had nearly made fatal. She looked different than she had in their shabby apartment, not because her clothes were expensive now, though they were, but because the weight of hiding had lifted from her shoulders, the constant vigilance of maintaining her secret identity, replaced by the exhausted relief of someone who'd survived something that should have killed them. When Emma's eyes met Derek's, he saw neither hatred nor love, only a vast emptiness that suggested he'd become irrelevant to her emotional landscape, a problem her lawyers handled rather than a person who occupied her thoughts. "You have 10 minutes, Emma said quietly, her hand resting protectively near Lily's bassinet, her body language making clear that Derek's proximity to his daughter was a privilege that could be revoked instantly. Derek had rehearsed speeches during the 3 weeks since everything collapsed, had written and discarded dozens of apologies attempting to capture the magnitude of his regret, but standing before the woman he'd destroyed, all his prepared words evaporated into silence because there was no language sufficient for what he'd done, no combination of syllables that could transform abandonment into anything other than unforgivable. "I didn't know," Derek finally managed, the words emerging as pathetic whisper, an excuse that explained nothing and excused less. Emma's expression didn't change, didn't soften with sympathy or harden with anger, remaining that terrible neutral emptiness that was somehow worse than hatred, because it suggested Derek had ceased to matter enough to generate strong emotion. "I know that doesn't change anything. I know that whether you were rich or poor, I should have stayed. I should have signed the authorization. I should have been there when Lily was born. But Emma, I didn't know who you were, and if you had known, you would have treated me better." Emma interrupted, her voice carrying a bitter amusement that cut deeper than screaming would have. "That's what you came here to tell me, Derek, that you only abandoned me because you thought I was worthless. But if you'd known I was wealthy, you would have been a decent husband." The logic of Derek's position collapsed under Emma's articulation, revealing the moral bankruptcy at the core of his regret. He wasn't sorry for his cruelty, only sorry that his cruelty had been directed at someone whose identity made his behavior costly rather than consequence-free. Derek's legs gave out, depositing him into a chair across from Emma, his face buried in his hands, as 6 years of marriage recontextualized themselves through the lens of his fundamental failure to see his wife's worth independent of her financial status. Emma had tested him in the most absolute way possible, had stripped away every external marker of value to see if he would love her anyway, and Derek had failed so completely that his failure had nearly cost Emma and Lily their lives. The baby stirred in her bassinet, a tiny sound that drew Emma's immediate attention, her face transforming with maternal tenderness that had never been directed at Derek, that he'd forfeited through choices he could never unmake. "I loved you," Emma said after a long silence, her words hitting Derek like physical blows because she used past tense, because the love she described existed in history rather than present reality. "I loved you enough to leave behind everything I'd ever known. I worked at that library for $15 an hour because being with you mattered more than billions of dollars. I endured your mother's cruelty because I thought our love was worth any sacrifice. But Derek, when I was hemorrhaging, when our daughter was dying, inside me, when I needed you most, you chose Veronica, you chose cruelty. You chose to see me as an inconvenience rather than your wife." Each sentence Emma spoke was delivered without tears, without raised voice, with the flat factuality of someone reciting established truth rather than expressing fresh pain. "The worst part," Emma continued, lifting Lily from her bassinet to cradle her daughter against her chest, "isn't that you left me. People fall out of love. Marriages end. I could have forgiven that eventually, could have co-parented civilly if you'd just been honest about your feelings. The worst part is that you left me to die, Derek. You refused medical authorization while I begged for my baby's life. You threw divorce papers on my bed while I was bleeding, and Veronica laughed. The final sentence emerged with the only crack in Emma's composure, a flash of remembered agony that revealed the wound Derek had inflicted went deeper than betrayal, deeper than divorce, into territory where forgiveness became impossible, because the injury had been too fundamental, too cruel, too deliberate. Derek watched his daughter, the child he'd accused of not being his, the baby whose life he'd endangered through his refusal, nestled peacefully in Emma's arms, and understood with crushing finality that he would never be part of this family, never share the casual intimacy of bedtime routines and first words and birthday celebrations. His 10 minutes were ending, Richard's assistant appearing at the door to escort Derek back to the lobby, back to his diminished life where his mother's broken health and his destroyed career served as daily reminders of consequences he'd earned. Derek stood on unsteady legs, wanting to say something profound, something that would at least mark this moment with acknowledgement of the catastrophe he'd caused. But Emma spoke first, her final words carrying the weight of permanent closure. "Lily will know who you are when she's old enough to understand," Emma said, her eyes meeting Derek's with that terrible emptiness that confirmed his irrelevance. "She'll know that her father valued money over love, that he abandoned us when we needed him, that he chose poorly and paid the price. But she'll also know that she comes from strength, that her mother loved her enough to risk everything, that her grandfather welcomed us home without judgment. You'll have supervised visitation rights if you complete the court-ordered therapy and parenting classes. You'll pay child support proportional to your income, though we both know that's symbolic rather than necessary. But Derek, you need to understand. You're not my husband anymore. You're not my partner. You're just my daughter's biological father, and even that role depends entirely on whether you can prove you're capable of putting her needs above your own." The finality in Emma's voice made clear this wasn't negotiation or opening position, but established reality that Derek's opinions couldn't alter, couldn't influence, couldn't change through any amount of remorse or reformation. The elevator descended through 40 floors of steel and glass, carrying Derek back toward street level, back toward the modest apartment he now rented, in a neighborhood Emma would never visit, back toward a life permanently marked by the worst decision he'd ever made. His phone buzzed with a message from his mother. Catherine's latest therapy appointment had been rescheduled, her recovery from the cardiac episode progressing slowly, her relationship with Derek strained by the knowledge that her cruelty toward Emma had contributed to the disaster that had destroyed their family. Derek emerged onto Seattle's rain-slicked streets, anonymous among thousands of people rushing toward their own destinations, and understood that this was his future now. Invisibility, irrelevance, the permanent consequences of having valued money over character, appearance over substance, Veronica's lies over Emma's love. 6 blocks away, in Richardson Technologies' 40th floor family apartment, Emma held her daughter against her chest and whispered promises about the life they would build together, about the values Lily would learn, about the importance of seeing people's hearts rather than their bank accounts. The story of Derek's betrayal would become Lily's cautionary tale, her reminder that true worth existed independent of wealth, that character revealed itself most clearly during crisis, that some choices created consequences no amount of regret could ever undo. And Emma, who had abandoned billions to find authentic love, who had nearly died because she'd chosen poorly, would raise her daughter to understand that wealth without character was worthless, but character without wealth was everything that mattered. The rain continued falling on Seattle, washing the streets clean but unable to wash away the permanent marks of betrayal, the scars of abandonment, the legacy of a man who'd had everything that mattered and had thrown it away because he'd been too blind to recognize its value until the moment it was irretrievably lost.